The next session, which I'm really excited about, we've got Sean McDowell and Clare Williams. Sadly, neither of them are joining us in the studio today. In fairness, Sean is in California, so that's fair enough. But we're so excited. Clare is the founder of a brilliant apologetics ministry called Get Real. She is studying for a master's in culture, diaspora and ethnicity at Birkbeck University. And she has been a teacher for years before retraining as an apologist. And I think probably most importantly for this session, she's a volunteer youth worker at her church. So she comes with great authority, knowing so much about young people. So too does Sean McDowell, as someone who's been working with high school kids for a really long time, has children of his own. He's the assistant professor in Christian apologetics at Talbot School of Theology, which is part of Biola University. And he has written tons and tons of books following in the path of his father, Josh McDowell. Some of these books include Chasing Love, Sex, Love and Relationships in a Confused Culture, So the Next Generation Will Know, which he co-authored with J. Warner Wallace, and a brilliant book called A New Kind of Apologist, which I am constantly dipping into. I am so excited to have you both here. And I suppose this question, the question of the seminar, the church is losing young people, can Jesus win them back? I think in my mind, it kind of evokes a twofold response, twofold question. I guess the first one is that question of why are some of these young Christians leaving the church? And the second one is about the non-Christian young people. Why are they not even engaging with it in the first place? So we'd love to know what you think. And don't forget, you can obviously be writing in your questions. Keep them coming right from the offset, because Clare and Sean are absolute experts in this area and will have lots of wisdom to shed on to your thing. But welcome, guys. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Hey, Ruth, thank you.
Brilliant.
Hey, Sean.
So a recent survey of English churches showed that half of churches have less than 5 under-18s. That includes babies. So that's in a UK context. So Clare, I wonder if you would perhaps sort of shed a little bit of light on why you think so many young people are leaving the church.
Yeah, the statistics are really quite scary, I would say, Ruth, and we need to do something about it. So I think there are 3 main things, and they kind of change according to the age of the young people we're talking about. But I think the 3 things are disillusionment. So this can come about through discovering that you've been sold or taught a self-help / motivational / prosperity type of gospel, or hearing about an influential church leader who has fallen or there's some moral failing. That can bring a sense of disillusionment, and it kind of is quite disorienting. The second thing is deconstruction, which is the word of the moment. And this is seen in statistical trends, but also social media trends as well. Deconstruction of one's faith, whereby questions or objections that a person has had, often on the back of disillusionment, are not addressed in the church, or they're told some sort of placebo statement, "Oh, go and read your Bible, go and pray more," and the question isn't given that kind of dignity that it needs. And around deconstruction comes doubts, no longer being satisfied with sort of blind faith being the way forward to being a guarantor for justified belief, and also again maybe thinking around deconstruction that Christianity lacks intellectual credibility. And the third thing is disengagement. And there's one thing, if we know about Gen Z, that they're very involved in activism. They're very they're very involved in moral progress. They want to see change. They want to change the world, but they think they can do that. And there's good reason for them to think they can do that from the way the church has kind of framed this discussion without the Christian faith. And so it's lacking that relevance or significance to it as well. So disillusionment, deconstruction, and disengagement.
That's such a helpful way of framing it, Clare. Thank you so much. Now, Sean, on the surface of it, it doesn't look as bleak in the United States. So around 75% of teenagers would call themselves a Christian, I guess, depending on what that means in the States. But what we've often seen is around 70% of young people will then leave the faith once they sort of get to their late teens, I guess college age, kind of 18, 19. Would you say just a little bit about what you think is happening in those latter teenage years and why there's kind of that sudden nosedive at that level in the States?
Yes, I'd be happy to. First off, Clare, that was a fantastic response with the 3 Ds, very thoughtful and succinct. I would just say a couple things that I think might help us out. Number one, I think it's important that we talk about kids leaving the church as opposed to just leaving the faith. Sometimes those statistics get confused. It's hard to know for a number of reasons how many kids are genuinely in the faith and then jettison it, but we can see how many are leaving the church. Now, you mentioned in the introduction that I wrote a book with J. Warner Wallace, who's a cold case detective. And in that book, because he's a detective, he tracked down every study we could find, dozens and dozens of studies, and said, what's going on here with this generation? And a couple things bubbled to the surface. Number one, as Claire pointed out, the movement away from the church is real. We might not have the exact statistics, and some vary, but there's a real consistent trend that we're seeing on the macro level, also on the deconstruction individual level. Second thing is it's starting early. So it's not just in upper high school level or in college that kids are leaving their faith. I think these seeds are being planted very early in elementary school, junior high, early high school, and they come to fruition during that time. Now, if I was to sum up two of the big issues at the heart of it, I think there's an intellectual component and I think there's a relational component. So if you look at why kids leave the faith, many will cite, for example, the Barna study that just came out. They'll cite things like the seeming conflict between science and faith. They'll cite things like 4 of the top 10 had to do with the problem of evil or hypocrisy. Other questions like Christians are viewed as being too narrow, and the LGBTQ conversation. Those are the issues that bubble to the top. But the largest study I'm aware of, this was done in, what was the year? 2013 by Vern Bankston, a professor at the University of Southern California. And they studied 3,500 people, 4 generations, 35 years, to find out what factors are present or not present when faith is transmitted from one generation to the next. And what they came up to statistically is the most significant factor in a kid staying in the faith is a, quote, warm relationship with the father. Now, that's not to downplay the significance of the mother, but let's face it, the father tends to be more of a wild card than a mother. So what this tells us is, yes, there's an intellectual component, and Claire hit on this in some of the talk that she mentioned about deconstruction, but there's a deep relational component. A lack of a relationship with other believers, with parents, and with the church is so deeply at the heart of why many kids walk away.
That's so helpful. And again, if we sort of flip to the other side, I guess some of it will be the same. But Claire, are there, in your opinion, any objections specifically to non-Christian children as to why they're not engaging even in the first place? And I'd also love to know, because this is kind of one of your areas of expertise, are there questions and objections, I guess, specifically to people within the Black community who, so they have reasons why they're not engaging with the church, would you say?
Yeah, thanks, Sean, as well for that piece about the relational aspects of why young people are leaving church as well. I think that's so important. And I think for me, non-Christians are not engaging with the faith because the alternative, so living without Christ or living as not as a Christian, it seems to be so satisfying. As I said before, the questions about Christianity, is it relevant? Is it contributing to human flourishing? And when a lot of the narratives are that Christianity is this oppressive regime that is just making truth claims and is trying to be powerful and is trying to silence the weak and the marginalized. If that is the picture of Christianity we're getting, because it's kind of like in the mainstream, then the non-Christian worldview seems a lot more palatable. And so I think lack of engagement comes down to, how is this actually helping me? And one of the features of Gen Z is they're a very pragmatic generation. And if they can't see that going to church on a Sunday is going to change the world for good, then they're not going to engage. And particularly around the Black community, I think the fourth D I would introduce is around the lines of decolonization. And let me just say, disillusionment, deconstruction, disengagement, and decolonization are not in and of themselves completely bad. I think all of us come to a place in our faith where we start to refine what we believe, and there's a kind of maturing of our faith, sometimes through these processes I've just described. But so decolonizing of one's faith and huge questions around, has the Bible been changed? That's a massive question or objection that comes from the Nation of Islam. What did Black people believe before the transatlantic slave trade? The massive thorny question of slavery in the Bible, and also the whitewashing of history and also theology, unfortunately, that we see in our seminaries, in our theological colleges, and then also, I have to say, something that actually bothered me, even as a Christian, particularly last year, as an objection that comes from the Black community, is when the issue or objections to Christianity are raised on the basis of race. So those questions are not dignified. Instead, we get the responses of critical race theory, wokeism infiltrating the church. And so all that is doing is giving young Black people another reason to say, well, the church doesn't really take what I'm saying seriously, so I'm going to walk away.
And Claire, you've got so many great resources on your website, getrealquestions.co.uk, if people want to explore that further, because Claire is so brilliant on this stuff. But Sean, just coming to you, would you say that it's similar objections that you have experienced, or are there different objections that young people that you work with sort of have to the Christian faith and to the church in particular?
Yeah, I can speak to kind of the American culture as a whole. And what I hear Claire saying are many of the same objections I will hear from my Black friends and other minority students that I work with. So there's definitely some overlap that is there. As a whole, what I think the studies show is the top questions that Gen Zers have. Number one, the intersection of science and faith. Now, the way this has changed with Gen Zers, this is not just the age of the earth. This also involves, can you believe in evolution and be a Christian? What about the vaccines? What about climate change? It's this larger question of how science intersects with the faith. And do I have to believe things that science tells me is not true to embrace the faith? That's a big one. The other huge question, whenever I do Q&A with students, the first or second or third question is always related to this larger LGBTQ conversation. And it's not just intellectual for them, like they say, parse Romans 1 for me or something like that. It's very personal because they have friends who are gay. Some of them wrestle with same-sex attraction, and they're trying to figure out, how do I stay faithful to what Jesus taught, but not be a bigot? How do I be loving? How do I be gracious towards people? And navigating that is very hard for this generation. So those are some of the big questions that I think this generation is asking: is science and faith, LGBTQ conversation. And then again, at the heart of it, if you look at the top 10 questions that are in the Barna research, 4 of the 10 intersect with the problem of evil and suffering. And at the heart of that is not, again, just an intellectual question. It's, why do I hurt? Why am I depressed? If there really is a God, why doesn't he fix my parents' marriage? Why do I feel so bad? That's at the heart of so many of the questions both Christians and non-Christians have. And by the way, you made a distinction earlier, Ruth, between questions that Christian kids have and those outside of the church. What I'm finding is they're asking a lot of the same questions.
It's really interesting as well, that distinction that you make from the sort of questions that were out there, which I guess were being asked sort of 10, 15, 20 years ago. But now the questions that are being asked are really the ones that kind of impact the personal, and whether it's them personally or their friends and their family. Now, I'm interested in what you think. Youthscape, which is a youth organisation here in the UK, did a piece of research recently called No Questions Asked, which basically suggested that in the young people that they were talking to, that actually questions weren't even really on the table. They weren't even thinking about these big questions. Do you think that's true? Or do you think perhaps it's that they do have these questions, they do have these innate desires to kind of know all of these different things, but perhaps they're just sort of under the surface? Claire, would you say just a little bit about whether you think, is there kind of that culture of apathetic, I'm not even asking the question because I'm just not even interested in it. That's fine for you, but it's not true for me. Or are there genuine questions, but perhaps they're sort of under the surface a little bit?
Yeah, that observation by Youthscape is really quite important. And I think when we think about what Gen Z is like as a generation, so they're digital natives and they're quite introvert. They're very driven, and a lot of this information was shared. I have to give a massive shout out to Christy Mayer. She did a fantastic presentation on Gen Z and how we can share the gospel with them. But being as Gen Z, they are digital natives and they're quite introverted because of that. Now we've just had a global lockdown where young people have had to be on their phones, on their laptops, on their iPads. I think the questions are there, but they're not expressing them in their youth group, in their church. I mean, are we creating the spaces? That's a whole other discussion to be had. Those questions aren't being maybe verbalized, but, the great prophets, TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube are being asked those questions instead. And so they're getting their information from social media platforms, from their friends, but it's internally. And I think when we think about the way that we believe we've been made in the image of God, we desire community, we desire relationship, we desire, to know meaning and in our suffering. We want to know things, but I think for Gen Z, that's directed internally and into the digital world.
That's really helpful. I guess we've looked at the kind of diagnostics of the problem, but Sean, the question that's probably on every person who's watching this today, what's the solution? Whose role is it, do you think, to sort of try and get rid of some of these objections and show our young people that actually the gospel is still as relevant as ever?
Yeah, very quickly, if I can play off something that Claire said. The first book I wrote, the subtitle was Being Bold in a Whatever World. 90s, 2000s, to each his own, whatever. Now this generation is just distracted. They're constantly distracted because of TikTok and YouTube. They never have a boring moment. But what I found, and you were hinting at this, Claire, is that when you have an adult step into their life, give them a safe place, and I know that's a loaded term when you say safe space, but I mean just a willingness to talk, a willingness to ask questions, a willingness to not lead with judgment. This generation has a lot of questions because, like every generation, they're made in the image of God. So the answer to your question is, whose responsibility is this? It's not primarily Claire's responsibility. It's not primarily my responsibility. It's all of our responsibility. Scripture puts the onus on one generation looking back. This is single people, it's coaches, it's parents, it's pastors. All of us have a role in some fashion to reach out and impact this generation. So I was speaking at a conference, this is probably 5 or 6 years ago, and I did Worldview for 2 days. And these students came up to me and they said, "Hey, we pretty much knew everything you taught." I said, I think they thought I was going to be offended that they didn't learn anything new. And I said, "That is so awesome. Who taught you this?" And they said, "Well, we had a retired teacher who would take us out once a week to coffee in the morning, and we would read books and we would talk about this stuff. And she just poured this into our life." And I thought, nobody's going to know her name this side of heaven, but she's a hero by doing what she could to stem the secular tide and pour into these young people. So my response, it's all hands on deck, because this generation has more intellectual, spiritual, relational, and emotional challenges and moral challenges just one click away than any generation in history.
And Claire, clearly one of the people who have a responsibility to share the gospel is young people themselves, young people who are kind of, who believe that this is true and want to share it. Would you have any advice for young people who are in that situation, wanting to show their friends who sort of, aren't really interested in this, that actually the gospel still is relevant?
Yeah, I think I just want to salute all the young people out there and all the youth workers who are doing exactly what Ruth has just described. It's really tough, and I really commend you on what you're doing. And I think just keep going. What I would say is to listen. Listening is really, really key. And being aware that people may not be talking to you about your faith every single day, but they are watching your behavior as well. And there will come a time, whether it's something that's happened in your life or their lives, where that conversation will suddenly be on the table. And I've always found that when I've been, praying about opportunities to share my faith with friends or family, then being surprised when the opportunities present themselves, and actually having the courage to take them and start to ask more probing questions that kind of turn up the temperature from just your daily sort of chit chat. And so taking the opportunities when they actually arrive, and also being aware, and this is what Sean was talking about, worldview, of the different worldviews and the kind of explanatory power that the Christian worldview has when we think about things like suffering, when we think about things like justice and moral progress, being aware of the power of the Christian message, the power of the Christian worldview to respond to these questions of culture at large.
We are going to be going to Q&A in just a minute, but Sean, if you could just summarise in a minute, as a parent yourself, as someone who's worked with lots of high schoolers and younger children, is there anything that you think specifically parents can be doing to help this?
Number one, build relationships with your kids. Spend time with them, listen to them, and everything doesn't have to be spiritual. I spend a ton of time with my kids talking volleyball and basketball and Marvel comics and what's going on in culture. Build relationships is number one. Number two, look for creative opportunities to have conversations with your kids. So very quickly, when I had a recent book come out, I wanted to get my daughter to read it. She was 12. So I said, hey, if you read this and give me your feedback, I'll take you to get a pair of shoes. She goes, Dad, I could get 2 for the price of 1. Is that okay? I was like, you can get 3 for the price of 1. So she read it. We went to coffee for an hour, hour and a half, and just talked about sex, love, and relationships. And then I bought her some shoes. That was just one creative way that I tried to find, knowing what motivates her, just to foster conversations with my daughter. So the quick answer is build relationships with your kids and look for strategic, natural ways to engage kids in conversation. And third, I would say, is we better make sure we're living it out ourselves. If we are not living a life that sacrifices for Jesus and it's not compelling to them and our kids don't want it, it doesn't matter what we say.
Brilliant. We're going to go to some of these questions now. And Claire, I'm going to start with you first, if it's okay. This question's come in from Warren, and it echoes quite a lot of the questions that have come in around, I guess, the differentiation between Jesus and the church. And he says, is it possible to be in the faith if you leave the church, due to the church being the body of Christ? How is it possible to be out of the church and still in the faith? You're a pastor's kid. You obviously grew up in the church. How do you think it is possible to be a Christian and to love Jesus, but to not be a part of the church? Do you think it is possible?
Do you know, I think that as I was talking about deconstruction there, a lot of that comes about through church hurt or seeing spiritual abuse or just experiencing pain in the church. And I do think that for a season, if you have been hurt in church, then taking a step back to heal, to not, because I've always been very active in church. So taking a step back to heal and not serve as much as you would normally, be involved in all the activities that you would do, just sit back and receive. That may well be sitting back and receiving, in kind of like live stream services or in the church, but I don't think it's healthy for you spiritually and long term to not be a part of the church. And Sean mentioned about the whole relationship, and I think the church as a community has that power to form really good relationships with young people. And so being away from the church for too long, I think, can be quite unhealthy. But if you need to heal, seek godly counsel, speak to someone, but do come back in the capacity and with the boundaries that you can maintain. I think that's really important, not to be away from church for too long. And also, if the Bible describes the church as the bride of Christ, I think it's difficult for me to love Jesus and hate the bride of Christ, which I myself am part of. So it's having that grace to know that whatever church you go to, there are people in it, and people are going to get it wrong sometimes. You may well get hurt, but also having the courage and the grace in the space to speak and to make whatever confrontation or discussion you need to have, but not to be away from the church for too long, because I do think in a long time it's quite unhealthy.
Sean, I'd love to ask you this question that's coming from Anna. If being narrow on the LGBTQ issue is a reason for young people leaving the faith, how can we enter into a conversation with young people on that without compromising our values, but still meeting the kids where they're at?
That is a wonderful question and the exact tension in which I live in all the time. So one thing we can do, and Claire mentioned this earlier, is ask a lot of questions and listen. Even though I'm an apologist and I've been on Unbelievable to have debates, believe it or not, when I'm with people, I ask a lot more questions than I do make statements. So I think in conversation, I'll just ask people questions about, who do you want to be? Who do you think Jesus was? What do you think marriage is meant to be? And I'll just listen. And if they're genuinely interested, then oftentimes they'll ask me back. Now, for Christian kids, one of the things we don't do is we don't give them reasons why God's design for marriage is as it is. That's the problem internally for the church. So I was at a conference with my dad, I don't know, maybe 2 years ago, and it was on sexuality. A 13-year-old came up to me and he said, "Thank you for telling me why pornography is bad. I've been told for years it's bad, but nobody's told me why." Our kids don't know why kids need a mom and a dad. They don't know why God designed marriage as he did theologically and sociologically. So for those inside the church, we've got to teach them the why behind the what. For those outside the church, it's relationships, it's kindness. I heard Daryl Bach at Dallas Theological Seminary say in 2014, he said, the narrative is that Christians are bigoted, hateful, intolerant, homophobic. He said, how do we turn this? He said, it's when we're in loving relationships with people and they hear that. And a thoughtful, gracious Christian is the next thing that comes to their mind, that it starts to change their mind about the church and be open to the gospel. So insiders, we need to give the why. Outsiders, we need to be in loving relationships and ask a lot of questions.
I mean, I think that's key, isn't it, to so many of the things that we're talking about when we're talking about young people, is just those loving relationships. We've got to earn the right to speak into their lives, haven't we, before we sort of begin to do that. Claire, there's a question that's come up here, which I know is absolutely huge for our young people. We have seen horrific statistics around mental health, particularly in the pandemic. Dylan has asked if there's any recommendations for people who are struggling with their mental health, I guess particularly made worse by the pandemic, and is there any way that the church can be helping in this area?
Thank you so much for your question, Dylan. I think it's so important. And I think what we see in the gospel, what we see in Jesus is he's called the suffering servant. He knows what it is to suffer. He knows what it is to feel and experience pain. I'm always so moved in the passage where Jesus hears of the death of John the Baptist, and he tries to spend some time away to grieve that out. It affected him. And so just to say to you that experiencing mental health is not something to be ashamed of, not to feel like you can't talk about it. In fact, you should do that very thing. You should be talking to people about it. You should be surrounding yourself with as again godly counsel, to make it through that season of your life. But also, my caution to the church would be not to over spiritualize mental health issues to the point where the only thing we have to offer is great Christian clothing line called Jesus and Therapy. It's a both, and we can do both at the same time. So the church can offer spiritual guidance, but it doesn't mean that we have to do that without, therapy or counseling or other means as well. It's nothing to be ashamed of. And this is, we're in a faith where God knows himself, what it means, Jesus, in the person of Jesus, what it means to suffer, what it means to struggle. And he is with you in that season of your life as well.
I think that's so helpful, and there's so many brilliant Christian charities out there that are working specifically in this area. Sean, I'd love to ask you a question that's come in from Richard. He's living in a post-industrial low-income area of northern England, like where I grew up. There is a massive issue of fatherless families, and there's evidence that when a father comes to faith, the rest of the family will as well. So where would you both put evangelism to men, and especially fathers, in relation to evangelism to young people? So I guess I would also love to add to that question, like, how do we do evangelism to fathers? Because it's such an important area, isn't it, Sean?
It is, and I would affirm that 100%. I don't think that's just true in his situation. That's true in all situations. There's something about the way God has designed fathers influencing the next generation. If I was in your setting and I don't know your context, one of the first things that I would do is I would find out who in your area is trying to reach fathers, what ministries already exist to men, and lock arms with them. It could be parachurch organizations. It could be church organizations. It could be national organizations that have branches in the area. You can't do this alone. There's power in a team, or even if it's just a few individuals that are there with you. I would come together. I would start to pray. I would fast for your area. And I would start to just brainstorm and say, God, use us to reach the fathers and break our hearts for the fathers within our context, and then go for it. So given that I don't know your exact setting, I'm not sure how to tell you how to do it, but I'd say don't do it alone. Find the people through prayer, through concerted effort, through research who are reaching fathers well. And that doesn't mean that it's less important in one sense to reach other people. We have to reach other people. But if God has put this on your heart, then follow that passion and go for it.
Do you think there's a sense as well in which actually we're called to be the father to the fatherless as well, where there are those fatherless children in our communities sort of rising up? And I guess that age-old adage that it takes a whole church to raise a child. Is there something to be said, do you think, Claire, for young men in the church actually taking responsibility and being father figures to some of those young people that have never grown up with a father?
Yeah, I think that's really important to have active men's ministries in our churches sometimes. And, there's some great, quite startling statistics about the numbers of men and women in churches. That, again, this is something we need to do something about. But as much as we can, it's about growing and discipling men in the church to do exactly what you've just said, Ruth, to be able to come alongside younger, to come alongside boys and younger men in the church to help them in their journey of faith. But I think at the moment, what we're seeing is not enough of that. Men living an example, being there already in the church, actively involved to be able to do that discipline that comes next. And just to say around the question of fathers, I have a friend of mine called Clare Williams, and she's got a fantastic ministry called Father to the Fatherless. You can find her on Instagram. She's a single mother herself, and she looks at the whole dynamic of being a single parent, a single mother, and how her faith actually roots her and grounds her in raising her son. And it doesn't discount her experience as a woman of faith as she tries to raise her son.
Sean, Erin here has commented on that beautiful picture you had of the retired teacher sitting with those young people going through some of those worldviews. She says, I love the beautiful picture of discipleship that Sean shared. Do you have any books or resources or recommendations for parents, teachers, I suppose youth workers as well, to use in these contexts with children and teenagers?
Well, you kind of threw me a softball, because the book that was mentioned that I wrote with J. Warner Wallace is to parents, it's to youth workers, and it's to Christian school teachers. It's not a what book, it's a how book, and it's called So the Next Generation Will Know. And it's very practical ways to do this strategy, so to speak. Now, if I was meeting with students, there's a few books that always come to mind. A very simple way to start with is obviously More Than a Carpenter. Short chapters. It starts with my dad's story of abuse and fatherlessness, in the sense of no father in the home, but present in his life. Gets right to the heart of who Jesus is. So that's a great book. I really like the book by Nancy Pearcey, Love Thy Body. I have taken high school students through this, and you just break it up into small sections. It's worldview based and talks about LGBTQ, talks about abortion, some of these hot topics, so to speak. So those are two that would be helpful. I wrote a blog. If you just search Sean McDowell, best resources for students on apologetics, it will pop up on Google, and you can see a number of other books and conferences and study Bibles that I recommend as well.
I've also got to do a shout out, because I used to edit the magazine, but Premier Youth and Children's Work have got a lot of brilliant resources in this area as well. And if you just go youthandchildrens.work/apologetics. There's a whole load of great apologetics resources to use with young people there as well. Now, Claire, we have spoken before about your love of the Bible, and that being something that even as a teenager you devoured. Claire did a brilliant interview for me a couple of weeks ago, which you can listen back to on Unbelievable. But there's a question here that Andrew has asked. Would you encourage young people to just pick up a Bible and read it? So I guess, Claire, do you think we need to come alongside young people and help them, or are we okay to just sort of give them a Bible and tell them to read it and trust that, God's truth will speak regardless of our interaction with them?
Yeah, I think the most effective way I've seen this done, particularly on sort of university campuses, is using the Uncover Gospels. So it's like just a single gospel, and it takes them through, and it's got different questions, different activities, different things to think about. And that could be done alone. We could give someone a copy of the Uncover Gospel of John or Mark or whatever, and that could be done alone. But actually, going back to what Sean was saying before, relationship is key. Coming alongside and reading with a young person, having a coffee date, meeting up, that kind of thing is really, really helpful. And also, giving young people the hermeneutical lens and the framework with which to read scripture. So, looking at the different types of genre in the Bible and how we can read them and how we can make sense of them. Because sometimes, if you just take any passage of the Bible and proof text, you can come into some problems. You can come out with some quite difficult questions. But actually, it's about framing it for our young people and not being afraid, even in the sort of the daily diet of our churches, to put difficult passage of scripture on the table and really work them through. So I would recommend that Uncover Gospels do come alongside them. Uncover can be read alone, but also looking at those more difficult questions in community.
I guess as well, the different translations of the Bible can sometimes be helpful. I know as a teenager, I loved different translations, so the New Living Translation, the Message Translation, the Street Bible, sort of anything that just made the language slightly easier to understand. Sean, there's a question here which I think you would probably have I think you both have lots of wisdom on, but it comes back to the way that actually this seminar was framed around the church kind of versus Jesus. Catherine asks, do you think that once you do end up getting young people back in churches, they might end up being bored by the format of having to listen for such a long time? So I suppose it's the question of actually, do we need to change the way that we're doing church in order to, I guess, one, retain, but also attract young people?
Yes, and here's the shift that I think we need to make. We need to move from teaching to training. Now, what do we mean by that? When we teach in a church, we're just giving information and then kids go on with their life. But think about like a boxer. What happens when a boxer, why are they training? Because on the calendar in 4 weeks, 6 weeks, 10 weeks, they have a fight. So the content they're getting matters to their life and they're being trained because they have to put it into practice. So in the church, we have to find ways that we're not just teaching kids material, but we're training them and we're taking them out to actually live this faith. Then what they're learning matters. So one way we do this at our Christian schools, every year we take an apologetics mission trip. And either we go to Salt Lake City and we will engage members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, Mormons, or we'll go to Berkeley, which is about an 8-hour drive, and we'll engage with agnostics and atheists. We've brought in some gay activists, some Unitarian Universalists. And what happens is when we're teaching in the church setting, these kids know, gosh, in 6 weeks, in 2 months, I'm going to be talking to an agnostic. I'm going to be knocking on a door and asking a Mormon what they believe about Jesus. I better start learning this stuff and applying it. So yes, we need to change. And what makes it more interesting is not just more song and dance and better communication. All those things are important insofar as they go. But we have to shift towards training that puts kids' knowledge into practice. That by default starts making what they're learning more interesting and relevant to their actual lives.
We're so nearly out of time, which is tragic because I feel like there is so much wisdom to be gleaned from the both of you. But before we go, Claire, this is a question from Mabin, and it sort of echoes a lot of the questions that have been asked. It's effectively about how do we sort of bring a young person back to faith if they have deconstructed? What's some of the advice that you would give, I guess, as a parent, as a youth worker, as someone in the church who's just passionate about that young person who's walked away? What are some of the practical steps that we can take to help draw them back onto the path?
Yeah, so around the whole topic of relationship is to listen to them, because likely that the moment a young person leaves church, there's been an entire space of time where they've had an internal conversation, they've had questions that they haven't really brought to the fore, and they've decided to leave and probably leave quite quietly. So listen to them, ask them questions. Why did you go? What's your major concern? What have you seen? How do you feel? Listen to what they have to say. And then when in the listening, you can glean, okay, so this is an existential question. This is an intellectual objection to the faith. This is to do with the Bible. This is to do with moral progress or social justice. So listening first of all, and it might not be that you'll listen to them and they'll come to church the next week, but actually spending time. I'm always struck in the book of Acts where Paul is, going to different places and sharing the faith. And it says, we stayed here for 3 months, we stayed there for 2 years, we stayed there for a few days. He's willing to put the time in. And are we willing to do that, to hold on to this young person and to constantly maintain a relationship, even if we might not see our desired result, because that's what was probably missing in the first place. So listening to their questions and giving the space for them to be answered. And then it requires of us to actually do a bit of research, to know how to respond to these questions and not just kind of give the glib responses of read your Bible, God moves in mysterious ways, those kind of things, not overly helpful.
Thank you so much. And one of, for me, the most terrifying verses in the Bible is Judges 2, verse 10, which says, after that generation died, another generation grew up who neither knew the Lord nor acknowledged his ways. And I just want to thank you guys for sort of standing up and saying, not on our watch. And that goes for all the parents, the youth workers, the young people listening out there. And I interviewed a 16-year-old recently who happens to be Justin's son and is brilliant. And he talked about the fact that actually he thinks there might be a bit of a seed change with people like Justin Bieber and Kanye West talking about their faith kind of openly on TikTok and Instagram and things like that actually we might be beginning to see young people see that as a viable option because these celebrities are talking about it. So let's be praying that that is the case.